Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I got a lot I want to get to, but let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of members of the listening audience to keep the network operating and the broadcast coming. So if you enjoy the information, the shows, the discussions, the topics, and the guests on the other shows, we sure would appreciate it if you'd find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month. Every membership counts, and we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on the newest developments on why the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal judges have been exposed as lying to the American people for 65 years about the fundamental constitutional nature of the income tax, and why the Supreme Court, in exposing those lies, has shut down the ability of the DOJ and the IRS to press any claims for federal income tax, well, you want to listen to the rest of the show and find your way over to taxfreedom.com and read the article about what SCOTUS did in June. Okay, so let's get into it. I want to do current events first here a little bit before we get into the discussion of the Supreme Court decision. We got a few things happening. You got the port strike, which looks bad. The Biden administration refuses to intervene, and it looks like it could go on for a while. And this Biden administration is just creating crisis after crisis. You've got an inflation crisis that, while it appeared to be abating, this port strike is going to push it right back if it goes on for very long. It's going to impact the availability and distribution of goods, at least on the East Coast, if not across the whole country. So, they don't want an automated port. That's the way the world is going. They want a large wage increase, and I don't know if the port authorities are going to give it to them or let the strike run. But the longer it goes, the more inflation is going to come back. So you got an inflation crisis, you got a hurricane crisis we're going to get to in a minute, you got an Iranian crisis. So with the port strike, Biden wants no involvement. With the hurricane strike, they got no money, it turns out. They spent it all on illegal aliens. And the Iranian crisis, they got no balls. They won't stand up and defend Israel. So this Biden dementia administration is just creating crisis after crisis after crisis. So let's go ahead and talk about FEMA. Mayorkas announced today that they don't have the money for FEMA to continue operating to help Americans in the hurricane crisis in Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Why don't they have the money? Hey, can you guess why? I'll tell you why. They spent it all on illegal aliens, flying them into the country, flying them around the country, putting them up in hotels, giving them credit cards, giving them food cards. They spent all the money on illegal aliens, Americans last, new foreign voters potentially first. That's why they don't have money for Americans, because the Democrats sold you out, America. They sold you out. They took the money that was intended to be used in case a hurricane occurs, like it did, and they spent it all on illegal aliens, housing them in expensive hotels. Not just in dorms on military bases or barracks, but in expensive hotels. And now they've run out of money. No money for Americans, unlimited budget for aliens. Yeah, right. You go ahead and vote blue. Vote blue and we're through. Vote red or we're dead. And Kamala wants to go back to the interventionist policies of the Depression era in the 1930s. She's talking about experimentation in government. In other words, they want to run a whole bunch of new programs to further take over the aspects of society, price controls. That's Russian. That's Russian economy. The government's going to dictate price because they think the food companies are gouging people at the supermarkets that operate on a 1.5% profit margin at best. No, the markets aren't gouging. They're passing through the cost of diesel fuel, which has had to been paid as a surcharge on top of the price of goods, because Biden's energy policy has driven the price of energy, gasoline, and diesel fuel so high that it now has become one of the primary cost components creating the inflation in the prices of the products. It all started with bad energy policy. It didn't start with bills that spend too much. That exacerbated it. It started on day one with energy policies when he destroyed the energy futures market and took America out of being energy independent and made them dependent on our enemies. And then, as it got tough, instead of turning the American energy production machines back on, he went begging to Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, OPEC, to produce more oil. Actually, not Russia, but they let Russia sell to China, and they went begging to OPEC, Iran, and Venezuela to produce more oil. Who told Biden administration to get lost. Why on earth would they lower the price of oil? They want the price as high as possible. And that's what funded the coffers of Russia and Iran and has enabled them, together with the $6 billion that Biden released to Iran, to fund the war of terrorism through Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah that Iran is funding, which has allowed Russia to wage war against the Ukraine for 2.5 years in an endless artillery battle. Yeah, right, Joe. Good job. Dragged us into, 3 wars? Embarrassed us in Afghanistan. It's the most incompetent administration in the history of America. And now it's been announced 600,000 illegal alien criminals at large and preying on the American people, ushered in by the Biden-Harris open border policy. Murderers, rapists, 600,000 criminals illegally allowed in, just ushered in with the, 12 million that they let cross the border? And now Kamala's talking about, we got to address housing holistically. It's a holistical need. We have to address it holistically with the states. I'm not sure what she's talking about there. You think she means she wants to put them in the churches and just let them sleep in the pews? Or maybe she's talking about putting them in a hole in the ground. Probably not, huh? Like at the cemetery? No, it must be the churches. She wants to put them in the churches. Well, I've got something to say about her housing policy. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But first, let's finish up with some of these insane policies and nonsense coming out of Kamala Harris's mouth. Because she's been saying things like, if she gets elected, she'll bring back up the border bill and sign it. What is she, an idiot? Does she not understand that when one Congress ends and another begins, as with the presidential election, that the bills of the old Congress are dead? They didn't pass. They can't be brought up and signed by a new president. They have to be reauthored and presented to the new president. And of course, that's never going to happen. They couldn't get it out of the Senate when the Democrats were in charge. There's virtually no hope of getting something like that out of the Senate and the new Senate upcoming. It kind of looks like the Republicans are going to take the Senate, but even if the Democrats kept it or it stayed 50-50, you couldn't get a bill through the Senate. You need 60 votes. So she's lying about that. And she's lying about codifying Roe v. Wade. Apparently, this Attorney General of California, is so dumb and ignorant about the law, she doesn't understand that the Dobbs decision means you can't write federal law for abortion. The Republicans can't ban it, and the Democrats can't allow it at the federal level. The Dobbs decision said there's no constitutional authority for an opinion from the court on this matter, which is why they struck down Roe, an opinion. And if there's no constitutional authority for an opinion, what do you suppose you'd have to argue the constitutional authority for a law is? That's right, there isn't any. The only way to get Roe into federal law is to amend the Constitution, 3/4 of the states. And that ain't gonna happen on this issue. Because half the states think it's murder to kill an unborn child in the 8th or 9th month, and most state laws recognize it as a form of manslaughter. If an assailant stabs a pregnant woman at the bus stop outside the hospital and the unborn child dies and the mother survives, the assailant is still charged with a level of manslaughter or murder. Now, if it's murder to kill a child with a knife at the bus stop outside the hospital, why isn't it murder for the doctor to kill the child with a knife inside the hospital? I understand there might be some exceptions, but not in the 8th or 9th month. That demands a premature delivery, a cesarean if necessary, to save the life of the mother. You don't abort the child in the 8th or 9th. That child should be carried to term and put up for adoption if the mother really doesn't want her own child. Put it up for adoption. There are 1 million couples in the country that would love to adopt a child. Oh no, we're going to abort it. That's infanticide! What are you, insane? Apparently so. Apparently so. The whole Democratic Party has gone insane. So how is it possible that an Attorney General of the state, doesn't understand? Dobbs says you can't have federal law. It's a state issue. And each state will decide it as it sees fit, and most of them have. And those where it's in contention will decide it by who they elect to the state legislatures, not to Congress. If you're voting in a federal election based on abortion issue, you've been misled. The federal legislatures cannot help you. It's the state legislatures that matter, not the Fed. So she's lying about that. She's lying about the border bill, and she's lying about the housing bill. Let's talk a little bit about that. I did an 8-minute video on the housing bill, and I'd suggest anyone who's interested go look at it, because giving $25,000 to first-time home buyers won't help them at all. In fact, it will hurt a lot of them by leading them into a trap they're not really prepared to deal with because they don't understand the consequences of what they're doing. A one-time $25,000 payment might be just enough incentive for someone to try and take on a $150,000 loan on a 30-year term at an 8% mortgage rate. Now, if you do that, take a $150,000 loan on a 30-year term at 8%, you have a monthly payment of $1,100 for 30 years, and at the end of 30 years, you will have paid back $396,000. The $150,000 loan plus $246,000 in interest to the bank. This loan makes the bankers wealthy, and paying that much out in interest is something that most people won't be able to do across 30 years, so they'll be forced to sell the home, or they'll be forced out of it if they lose their job. So setting somebody up to take this 30-year loan at 8% by giving them $25,000 to make the down payment to qualify hurts them. It doesn't help them. You want to know how to help them? You give them a 2% loan on a 20% term. That reduces the amount of interest paid to $32,000. It reduces the monthly payment to $750, $350 less than the 30-year term. Just $750 instead of $1,100, and only $182,000 repaid. The bank makes nothing. The couple saves $214,000 across 20 years, or $10,000 a year for 20 years. That's how you promote housing and give people an economic opportunity to do it. You do it with a 2 or 3% loan from HUD. That's how you promote housing. It's the interest rate. The down payment means nothing. $25,000 is a joke. $10,000 a year for 20 years? That's making housing affordable and providing opportunity. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just go ahead and get right back into it. Freedom comes from God, not government, and it is the truth that shall make you free. So if you want to know the truth, find your way over to libertyworksradionetwork.com and taxfreedom.com and start reading about the Supreme Court decision. Came down in June, where the Supreme Court gave us exactly what I've said we've needed for 25 years. Not a new decision on the income tax, but a reaffirmation of the original decision in Bruce Shaber. And that's exactly what Justice Kavanaugh has given us in his opinion in the Moore et al. V. United States case decision last June, issued. Hasn't been incorporated into the Supreme Court recorders yet, so it's just listed as 22-800. You just Google Moore et al., that's UX, v. United States, and you'll find the case. Et al. Means and his unnamed wife, who's part of the case because it's a joint return, but she didn't want to really be part of the case, but she's on the joint return. So it's unnamed wife. And in this decision, this is the mandatory repatriation tax challenge that was made. The court ruled they can tax unrealized gains coming out of a foreign corporate ownership, foreign corporate structure of ownership, where the court held it's a pass-through relationship. So even though no gains were realized by the individual American shareholder, gains were realized by the company they owned a part of, and their share of those gains was due to be reported on their tax return reporting the foreign earned income that was accrued to them through the corporate ownership, even though it hadn't been paid to them. And there is a treaty with India, which is where the foreign company was, and so the court upheld the mandatory repatriation tax. They can tax unrealized gains associated with the ownership of foreign corporations, and gains made by those foreign corporations, even though no dividends are paid or no monies from the foreign operation are repatriated by the U.S. shareholder. So it sounds bad, but it isn't, because in assessing the authority for this tax on foreign corporate structure, Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice who wrote the opinion in Moore, went through the basic foundational powers for the federal income tax. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But first, let's talk about what the IRS has been doing in court for 45 years, because they've labeled the argument that the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct non-apportioned federal income tax on United States citizens as a frivolous argument. And they have fined Americans who argued that up to $25,000, hundreds of thousands of times, to shut down the argument. Some of the cases they've cited and their justification for it, I'm reading now from the IRS's frivolous positions document. These are some of the cases they cite as supporting their holding that the income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax without limitation under authority of the 16th Amendment, and has been so since 1913 when the amendment was adopted. The first case is United States v. Collins, which the Justice Department literally cites in every document pleading they submit in the courts, arguing against the position that the income tax is being wrongfully enforced because it's an indirect tax under Article 1, not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. So here's what they held. The court found defendants' arguments that the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct non-apportioned tax on United States citizens, similarly to be devoid of any arguable basis in law. In R.E. Beckraft, the court affirmed a failure to file conviction, rejecting the taxpayer's frivolous position that the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct non-apportioned income tax. Lovell v. United States, the court rejected the argument that the Constitution prohibits imposition of a direct tax without apportionment, and upheld the district court's frivolous return penalty, asserting that the legal position, the taxpayer's legal position, was patently frivolous. the appeals court imposed additional sanctions for pursuing frivolous arguments in bad faith. Okay. In Broughton v. United States, the court rejected a refund suit stating that the 16th Amendment authorizes imposition of an income tax without apportionment among the states, which is true, but only as an indirect tax, not a direct tax. Broughton was aware there was a problem. They stayed away from saying it's direct. Okay, here in United States v. Hawkinsmith, the court held that the 16th Amendment allows for the taxation of income and eliminates the requirement for apportionment among the states. Again, staying away from declaring it's direct, but upholding such application by the IRS and argued position by the DOJ in the case. And in Maxwell v. Internal Revenue Service, the court found that the taxpayer's arguments to have been routinely rejected. Principally, that there is no law that imposes an income tax, nor is there a non-apportioned direct tax that could be imposed on him. In Stearman v. United States, the court imposed sanctions totaling $25,000 against the taxpayer for advancing arguments characteristic of tax protester rhetoric that has been universally rejected by the courts, including arguments regarding the 16th Amendment. In affirming the tax court's holding, the circuit court granted the government's request for further sanctions against the taxpayer for maintaining frivolous arguments on appeal. So you can see, the lower circuit courts, not a single one of these decisions is from the Supreme Court. Every single one of these is from lower circuit courts and upheld by circuits. They have been arguing and telling the American people for 65 years, since early 1960, the 16th Amendment authorizes them to enforce a direct, non-apportioned tax on your work because you work, and the tax is without subjectivity to any constitutional limitation at all. So let's read what Justice Kavanaugh said in this 7-2 decision in Moore v. et al. This is from the syllabus now. A. Article 1 of the Constitution affords Congress broad power to lay and collect taxes. That power includes direct taxes, those imposed on persons or property, and indirect taxes, those imposed on activities and transactions. Direct taxes must be apportioned among the states, according to each state's population. Notice how he says direct taxes have to still be apportioned. He doesn't say there's an exception. He says direct taxes still have to be apportioned, while indirect taxes are permitted without apportionment but must be uniform throughout the United States. Section 8, Clause 1, he cites the Constitution. He goes on, taxes on income are indirect taxes. Taxes on income are indirect taxes. Justice Kavanaugh just wiped out every single circuit court case cited by the IRS claiming it's a direct tax without apportionment. Every single one of the circuit cases are overwritten and overruled by this decision. Income taxes are indirect taxes, and the 16th Amendment confirms that taxes on income need not be apportioned because they're not direct. They only need to be uniform. So right out of the syllabus, Kavanaugh gives us what we need. It's an indirect tax, and this destroys the ability of the government's argument to argue that the court can uphold and sustain the assessment for tax that the IRS has made based on the erroneous belief and practice, de facto practice, that it's a direct tax without limitation and without regard for any subjectivity to any impost, duty, or excise, which are what indirect taxes are composed of. Why don't we read a little bit more from the opinion? Article 1 of the Constitution affords Congress broad power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. That power includes two great classes of taxes, direct taxes and indirect taxes. He cites Bruce-Shaber v. Union Pacific, the original case. He's reaffirming Bruce-Shaber. This isn't a new decision. It's just what you need, a reaffirmation that proves it was always indirect. It was never, ever a direct tax. The frivolous position was held by the circuit courts. The fines imposed on the citizens were criminal actions by courts acting without subject matter jurisdiction to enforce a direct tax that doesn't exist. It's indirect. The court goes on. Congress has rarely enacted direct taxes because the Constitution requires that direct taxes to be apportioned among the states. Again, he reaffirms the requirement for all direct taxes to be apportioned. To be apportioned, direct taxes must be imposed in proportion to the census or enumeration. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. See also Section 2, Clause 3. In other words, direct taxes must be apportioned among the states according to each state's population. So he's asserting there's no exception under the amendment. Direct taxes are apportioned according to the proportion. Indirect taxes are uniform. The 16th Amendment makes the tax indirect because it is a tax without apportionment. It has always been held to be indirect because those taxes don't have to be apportioned. So there's no problem with the 16th Amendment authorizing income tax as part of the indirect taxing powers. But the 16th Amendment cannot be used to argue that income is a fourth power to tax beyond impost, duty, and excise. Because in order for it to be a fourth power to tax indirectly, that would be a new power created by the 16th Amendment. And in order for a new power to be enforceable in the courts, the amendment would have to contain an enabling enforcement clause to authorize Congress, constitutionally authorize Congress, to write law to enforce the alleged new fourth power to tax income. But there is no enabling enforcement clause, so income can't be a fourth power. It can only be a function of the three existing powers, impost, duty, and excise. And the courts have laid out the function for us historically. The courts have said that income is not the object of the tax. It's not the subject of taxation. It's the yardstick by which the amount of tax owed is measured. And the tax is owed on earnings derived from activities or transactions specifically made subject to an impost, duty, or excise tax that Congress has written. If there is no impost, duty, or excise, there's nothing to measure. You then just don't tax earnings as though it were a direct tax without limitation. You need a taxable activity, impost, foreign activity, foreign imports, foreign persons, and in foreign places. Doesn't include the labor of American citizens in the 50 states. Duty, the taxation of exported goods. Doesn't include the labor of citizens in the 50 states. Excise taxation, the power to tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, things like alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and petroleum fuels. It's a tax on licenses to pursue certain occupations like selling alcohol, tobacco, or firearms, or transporting petroleum fuels across interstate lines. And it's a tax on corporate privilege, where it is the privilege of the license or incorporation or dealing in commodities that is the subject of the tax. It's not the earning of money. And there is no power to tax under the excise category, just like there is none under impost or duty. There is no power to tax the labor of the American people within the 50 states. It applies to commodities, licenses, and corporations. Title 15, Section 17, Congress was forced by the labor unions to write this in the 1930s when they saw it coming. The statute says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. That statute specifically removes your labor from subjectivity to excise taxation, which is on commodities and articles of commerce. And there is no privilege enjoyed in earning money. It's an exercise of a right, unlike the corporate person who only earns money through the enjoyment of the privilege. Citizens in the 50 states engaged in common occupation at law or common law occupation only earn money through the exercise of right, no taxable privilege involved. There is no excise tax. There is no impost tax. There is no duty that applies to your labor. That's why they've had to argue it was the 16th Amendment. That's the only way to get to the taxation of labor, as though it were direct and without limitation. They have to do it. They had to argue 16th Amendment, or you couldn't tax labor because of Title 15, Section 17. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I'm just going to get right back into it because I want to finish up here focusing on this Moore decision and why it completely destroys absolutely everything that has been happening in the federal courts. And this decision can be used today to stop every single legal action in the court, civil and criminal, pursued by the Department of Justice in the district or circuit courts or in the Supreme Court for the payment of federal income tax. All of these trials are being conducted without subject matter jurisdiction, because the IRS assessed a direct tax when it's not direct, and therefore the assessments can't be sustained because the court can't enforce a direct non-apportioned tax that doesn't exist under the Constitution. The circuit courts have been lying, the DOJ has been defrauding, and what they've all been enforcing is not constitutional taxation, but the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which reads a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find the graduated direct taxation of labor is in the Communist Manifesto, used to divide the people into classes and create a system of class warfare that destroys the system of unified representation that the constitutional republic is supposed to be provided under the Constitution. So this is how they've advanced their liberal agenda, and why it keeps getting worse and more socialized is because as long as they're allowed to reach into your pocket and steal the revenues to fund the agenda and the transition to the socialist democracy, they're going to. You will be enslaved to the appearance of a false majority that the media and the government invent every time they want to take over control of an issue, because in a democracy, the majority rules. And the law doesn't control anyone except the enemies of the state. So let's continue reading with this decision. Here, Justice Kavanaugh discusses how direct taxes work. So, if Congress imposed a property tax on every American homeowner, the citizens of a state with 5% of the population would pay 5% of the total property tax, even if the value of their combined property added up to only 3% of the total value of homes in the United States. To pay 5%, the tax rate on the citizens of that state would need to be substantially higher than the tax rate in a neighboring state with the same population but more valuable homes. To state the obvious, that kind of complicated and politically unpalatable result has made direct taxes difficult to enact. Indeed, the parties have cited no apportioned direct taxes in the current Internal Revenue Code. And it appears that Congress has not enacted an apportioned tax since the Civil War. See 12 Stat 297. E. Jensen, The Taxing Power, a reference guide to the United States Constitution. Now, did everybody get that? The parties have cited no apportioned direct taxes in the current Internal Revenue Code. One of the parties to this case was the United States. It's Moore et al. v. United States. The United States could not cite a direct, non-apportioned tax in the current Internal Revenue Code. Well, that's funny. That's what they've been arguing for 65 years. Oh, but they didn't want to touch that in the Supreme Court, did they? No, that lie is reserved for enforcement and argument and presentation only in the corrupt, socialist, communist, seditious circuit courts, where the judges have betrayed the American people and aren't enforcing the Constitution anymore. They're enforcing the agenda of socialism under the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, to balance the fifth plank, which is the Federal Reserve Bank, which is who you're being governed by, not the president. When Biden opens his mouth, everybody laughs. When the Federal Reserve speaks, the whole world tunes in to find out what's going to happen next around the planet. It's not constitutional taxation. It's a system of debt service. The United States couldn't cite a direct tax in the code. But that's what they argue every single time they're in the courts. And Congress has not enacted an apportioned tax since the Civil War. That's a quote. If they have not enacted, well, wasn't the income tax enacted in 1913? And isn't that after the Civil War? And has not enacted an apportioned tax since the Civil War. So obviously the income tax is not the direct tax the government has been lying to you and enforcing with liens and levies and foreclosures for 65 years. All that's necessary to defeat this is for this wave of knowledge and consciousness to sweep across the country so that juries tell the government, no more, not guilty. Civil and criminal, not guilty. Foreclosure actions, not guilty. The state court should collectively ban the enforcement of all these fraudulent liens that were secured arguing for a direct tax without limitation when no such thing exists and can't be enforced by the state courts just because the federal court made it up. The state courts are sworn to the Constitution as well. Under Moore, every single lien in the country has to fall. All you got to do is contest it in the court where it's filed. Let the Justice Department show up and argue how they assessed and can support a direct tax when the Supreme Court says no such thing ever existed. Ever existed. Never. Never existed. The whole thing is a liberal judicial fraud based on sedition and judicial legislation at the constitutional level. Every single one of them is either brain dead, stupid, or guilty as sin. You decide. I think it's a whole lot of all three. Oh, let's hear. The Supreme Court goes on. By contrast, indirect taxes are the familiar federal taxes imposed on activities or transactions. That category of taxes includes duties, impost, and excise taxes, as well as income taxes. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Amendment 16. Income taxes under the 16th Amendment are indirect taxes. He says it right here. Under the Constitution, indirect taxes must be uniform throughout the United States. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. A tax is uniform when it operates with the same force and effect in every place where the subject of it is found. Okay, now I'll argue that. I think it's only uniform where it doesn't discriminate against the American people on any basis. That was the basis for indirect graduated taxes in the 1880s, the power of Congress to discriminate. The power to use graduated tax brackets is based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate articles of commerce and commodities subject to tax. And I would argue to discriminate against the inanimate corporate person, the privileged licensed person, and the privileged foreign non-resident person. Graduated brackets are based on the power of Congress to discriminate, and in the 1880s, no graduated tax applied to the labor was applicable to the labors of the American people. Only corporate earnings and licensed earnings, ATF. So graduated taxes were upheld based on them not applying to citizens, and then after World War II, it began being assumed by citizens. But can it be enforced by the court as a graduated tax bracket just because all the rich people and all the poor people in New York are treated the same as the rich people and the poor people in California? Oh, you can do that? Well, then could we treat all the Jews in California and New York different than the Christians? Or the Islam believers? Could we treat them different? Can we treat the women different than the men? The gay different from the straight? The old different from the young? The rich different from the poor? The Italian different from the Irish? What power does Congress have to discriminate against the American people? Can it discriminate on any of these bases? No, of course not. And guess what other bases it's prohibited from discriminating on? That's right, wealth, success, productivity, and yes, income. It's an unconstitutional tax when applied as a graduated tax and enforced as such against the American people, rather than the corporate person or the licensed person. Corporations, everything they do is inherently taxable because it's all earned through the privilege of incorporation. It's not true of the individual citizen as a person. That individual enjoys no such taxable privilege in the earning of money. It's all earned by right. Interest, dividends, compensation. It's all earned by right. It's not taxable as a function of being earned because it's subject to a direct non-apportioned tax that doesn't have foundational application to impose duty or excise taxable activities. If there's no ATF, if there's no import-export, if there's no foreign activity, if there's no activity in any foreign place or under a tax treaty, there's nothing to tax, there's nothing to measure. It's not a tax based on you working. And this is what the Supreme Court lays out. Or at least it's what they reveal with what they lay out as being applicable. Indirect taxes have to be uniform. The income tax is not. And it has to be indirect. It has to have basis in impost duty and excise. And direct taxes are described by the court as never having been changed. No direct taxes since the Civil War. This argument that the DOJ makes, all of this frivolous position held by the IRS and argued by the DOJ to punish Americans, they're the ones with the frivolous position in America. The DOJ is lying. The IRS is lying. The federal judges are lying. Not a single one of them can take subject matter jurisdiction to enforce any of these. Neither can the tax court enforce an unconstitutional version of the tax. And Moore sets aside and overrules every single one of those decisions I read to you from the frivolous document position. They're all rendered erroneous, fatally erroneous. And they create the grounds for a massive multi-trillion-dollar class action lawsuit against the United States. The DOJ, the circuit courts that have done this to people, ordered the district courts that have ordered and upheld the taking of people's homes for allegedly not paying a direct tax on labor as though you were a slave. Because that's exactly what they've been doing. Unconstitutionally enforcing a tax that doesn't exist, and the Supreme Court has just given you what you need. It's not a new ruling that says, oh, it changed because of Trump. The Trump tax law merely documented that the constitutional authority for the new law was Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which I've been teaching for 6 years, since January 2018 when it happened. They've said it was always an indirect tax. They've reaffirmed Bruce Shaber as the original holding determining it's indirect, which means it's been indirect all along. Everything that's been done to you by the IRS and DOJ in court was a fraud. You have the right to participate in a class action lawsuit, and the only way out of this is for Congress to write law absolving the past of blame. Everybody that was stolen from in the courts has an action that I don't think Congress can get rid of without providing money to pay them. So if you've been convicted or if you're in court, you need to contact me through irszoom.com, and I'll provide you with the motion or motions that destroy the government in court. They can't survive this. The Moore decision overturns everything they've been arguing. This is the heart of the case. This is a spear through the heart of the IRS, the DOJ, and the seditious judges who have been using judicial legislation instead of constitutional law to uphold the de facto system instead of a de jure administration of it. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We urge you to keep listening. I'll be back next week with more. And if you need help, irszoom.com. If you want to get informed, tax-freedom.com. Get educated, get informed, take back your country. Thank you. You too. Bye bye. Okay, stop recording.